Also, all of these albums that we've put out, they're on my label, and I just license them to Sony BMG.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah, and so we own our whole catalog. So nobody tells us how to do stuff.
Intellectual property or IP is the lifeblood of your work as a creator. Now, you can't have IP around your idea, but you can have IP around the execution of your particular idea. For instance, you can have a melody in your head. That's not intellectual property. But once you commit it to music or write it down into some sheet music, then it becomes intellectual property. And if you don't own your own IP, then you don't control how it's actually being distributed, or what money, if anything, you get from it. You might not even control if you get credit for the intellectual property once it's out into the world. Intellectual property is power.
It's Debbie Deb when I hear music.
Yep.
She was 17 years old. She was a record store employee in Miami when Pretty Tony Butler came into the record store. Producer Pretty Tony Butler and had her sing on a couple tracks he was working on. One of those classic examples, unfortunately, of the thing you're hearing in the sample. The person's voice you're hearing got nothing from it. She got work for hire. She got paid on the day. But in spite of that song being sampled so prominently on this huge, important song, she's not getting.
She doesn't get publishing.
Did you ever hear anything from her team or any other teams that sampled any of your songs?
No, they don't reach out. They don't. No, they do not. Not to me anyway. No, they don't.
Who would they reach out to then, if that's the case?
Probably the people who own the rights to the music.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's they'd have to reach out to them, because like I said, I didn't get the right music, so they got to reach out to somebody, and it's not me. So
Here are 3 ways you can protect it. The first one is to actually do it yourself, DIY it. That means write the book. That means commit to recording the music in your closet. Get the thing done. Now, this requires extra investment as far as time, energy, resources, even money into getting it to yourself. But that means you can control where the product is out, how the service is being used, and ultimately be able to control your destiny in a way that other people cannot. Just be wary of companies that want to partner with you, because if you end up signing the wrong distribution contract, you could actually lose control of your intellectual property. Second, you can negotiate your intellectual property back. Let's say you end up signing a deal with a major company and then decide to go independent. That's not the end of the world. You can actually negotiate to get that IP back. You can do some sweet talking and good negotiation. You could pay them to get your intellectual property back. In fact, there's ways that you can do this that make it a lot easier for you to maneuver, because you have the resources initially of this big company and now you're going independent. The best time to do this, I found, is when companies are going in a different direction. For instance, if it's a music group that has your particular type of music for a little while when they signed you, and then suddenly they're going a different direction. You don't fit in their catalog anymore. Or in cases where the company itself is going bankrupt or going through a major shift as far as leadership. I've negotiated my stuff back. It's worked out well for all parties, and I was able to get control of my intellectual property. This is what musicians talk about when they talk about getting their masters back from the music publishers.
All I know is that I cannot get a record contract. We cannot get a record contract unless I take these tapes. And granted, the tapes themselves are your that you own them, okay? But the magic that is on the tapes, that fucking heart and soul that we put into those tapes, that is ours, and you don't own that. Now I need to take that magic and get it to the record company.
Third, you can license your intellectual property. You work with a major company who likes whatever you're bringing to the table. You end up working together for a limited amount of time, and you end up splitting whatever proceeds there are from that distribution that you got from that company. Now notice I said the limited amount of time, so there are guide rails to this. The best distribution deals or partnership deals have a certain type of time limit or a certain amount of units or products sold, and then the IP reverts back to you. I've been able to make really good money from folks using my book content in a limited way. We split down the profits and we're both happy with it, and I'm able to keep my intellectual property. But none of these intellectual property ideas make any difference if you don't know how to read a contract and to watch out for the red flags. Here are some red flags to avoid in your next contract. There's the business, which is the creative work that you do, and there's the business of the business, which are the taxes, which are the invoicing, which are the systems you have in place, a lot of stuff that I coach about. Those things are so important. If you don't have the business and the business together, you're not gonna be able to survive to actually do the creative work that you wanna do. And my name is Damon Brown of DamonBrown.net. My main thing is help you as a side hustler, solopreneur, otherwise a non-traditional entrepreneur. Today we're going to talk about contracts. They can be pretty boring. I personally love contracts. I took a couple of law classes when I got my journalism degrees. I found it fascinating, and that's one of the reasons why I became a coach, because we end up working with what's called intellectual property, or IP, and that ends up being what we create and how much we're able to own of it, if we own any of it at all. There's been so many people in rap culture. I've heard about a lot of them lately. There's been people in the artist community as far as fine art, where particularly lately in 2022, I was talking to a friend about this, but we're still not reading contracts. And there are people that are doing killer, amazing work, but their contracts are wrong. Again, that's a big part of the coaching that I do, is helping folks like yourself get their contracts straight. Now, I am not a lawyer. I took a couple of law classes, but I am not a lawyer. But I do understand how to hold on to intellectual property, how to think about intellectual property, and most importantly, how to help you value your intellectual property. So today we're going to talk about 3 big red flags that you want to look into before you sign any type of contract, whether you're an independent creator like myself, or even if you're signing up for a job. Again, my name is Damon Brown of DamonBrown.net. You're watching the Bring Your Worth show every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, Vegas time. If you're liking this kind of content about passive income, about creating your worth or building your worth, or even showing up in the way that you want to show up in your career and in your work, be sure and subscribe. It's always free. And share it with people that you like, even like the video if you're feeling it. All right. So again, I am not a lawyer. You better call Saul. You better not call me. Be sure and get legal advice if you're getting into really big contracts. I have a couple lawyers that I've worked with, even though I know law fairly well when it comes to intellectual property, but I still need help and support. And I want to share some of that wisdom with you so you can at least get started with thinking about this process. All right, so when you're looking at a contract, the number one red flag, or one of the 3 red flags, I should say, is something that's called a work for hire. The work for hire is literally what it sounds like. You're working for someone for hire. It's the equivalent of getting hired for something and then not owning what you're actually doing. It's equivalent of you going into someone's house and helping them with their plumbing. You don't own a piece of the house, right? You're not going to live in the house after the plumbing's done. No, you're going to go ahead and use the plunger, do the Roto-Rooter thing, take the snake, which if you're a homeowner, you know exactly what the snake is. You're going to fix it. You're going to get paid for it, hopefully, and then you'll never talk again. You don't own any piece of it. That's what work for hire means. Someone's hiring you to create something. Now, if you're creating a book, a piece of music, an article, even something that's even more complex than that, if you sign something that says work for hire, that means you have no legal rights to whatever you're creating. Now, there's a few things that you can deal with work for hire. The first approach, if you see someone that's asking you to do a work for hire, is to not do it. Now, to not do it or to refuse to do it, you need to figure out if you're actually going to be doing something else with the work. Now, I have several passive income streams. I have a whole litany. I think litany is the word. You would think I wasn't a journalist, but I actually am. I have a whole litany of videos related to passive income. I'll be sure and put a link in the show notes. But my passive income comes from me knowing 5, even 10 years ago, that some of the work I would be creating, I'd be able to repurpose for something else. For instance, I have a column with Inc. magazine at inkdamonbrown.com. When I did the column, I started like 6 years ago with Inc. I negotiated the contract, or at least made sure the contract was clear, so that they would understand that once I created a column for them, I could actually use it for other purposes. A lot of those columns became the genesis of the Bite-Sized Entrepreneur. I have Ultimate Bite-Sized Entrepreneur, but the original Bite-Sized Entrepreneur became a bestseller about 2 years after I started the Inc. column. So if I didn't negotiate that contract and have that vision and say, the stuff I'm writing for Inc. might have another purpose, then this major passive income stream, and in fact, the beginning of my book imprint, Bring Your Worth, would never have happened. If it did happen, it wouldn't be with that same content. So me talking with Inc., I knew a few years later I might be doing something else with the content. So I made sure it wasn't a work for hire. The second way you can deal with a work for hire is to make it a short-term or short-run ownership. For instance, if you're working with a company or organization, you might say you have exclusive rights. That's the term. You have exclusive rights to whatever I'm creating. But after 6 months, you can hold on to some of those rights and I can actually go and use it somewhere else. Again, this becomes really useful if you're a journalist. If you're creating a piece of music, it might be exclusive for a particular movie, for say that run of the movie. But as soon as the movie's out of the theaters or out from Netflix, whatever, maybe you get the rights back and it can be put somewhere else. That could be a middle ground. The last way you can work with the work for hire is actually lean into it, but actually ask for more. I actually wrote for a major publication and they said there was no way I can get out of the work for hire. In other words, whatever work I was doing for them, they would own it forever. It's called in perpetuity. See, I can't even say the word. That means forever. So we will own this forever. There was no way I could negotiate my way out of it. Instead, though, I said, listen, this work is valuable. Y'all are asking me to write for you, so I have a certain expertise. If you want to hold on to this work, you got to pay me more. And they agreed. So I'm being paid, I want to say about 50% more than what they were actually saying in the first place. So they kept the work, and I was able to pay a lot more of my rent. So there's ways you can negotiate with the work for hire, but you do not just want to sign it. Second red flag when it comes to contracts is no set payment date. Now, a lot of us get excited, particularly when we start off and we look immediately at how much we're being paid. Oh my gosh, you're being paid $1,000 for doing often the work that we love. And we're like, yes, $1,000, that's fantastic. Where do I sign up? What we often forget is when we're going to get paid. Because they can promise $1,000, but if it's not going to come for a year, it's not going to matter, particularly, again, we have rent due. And so there's a couple ways that you can deal with if there's no set way as far as knowing when you're going to be paid. The first way is to give pushback and say, what is the net? Net is the average amount of time that you can expect to get paid for, or actually the set amount of time, I should say. So if someone says net 30, then that means within 30 days, you should get a check, 30 days after you invoice them. So push for the net. You can ask the accounts payable people, they're called AP. You can ask the organization or the people that you're working for directly, if you're working directly with a creator, and say, hey, what's the net on this? They will understand. The second way to deal with it, if there's no set pay date, is to ask for part of it in advance. Now, I've asked this for like my bigger projects, but even some of my smaller projects, where I say, hey, if you want me to get involved with this, then why don't you go and give me half up front, and that'll keep both of us honest. I have the half, I can get started on the work, and when the work is done, complete, accepted, then I can get the other half of it. So we both have skin in the game. What you don't want is to be creating something or to be building something, and then you might get paid in often a distant future, or worst case scenario, which I've been in several times over my decades as a freelancer, you don't get paid at all. That sucks. Your time is your money. You're running a business. As I say all the time, there's the business, which is the creative work that you do, and there's the business of the business, which are the taxes, which are the invoicing, which are the systems you have in place. A lot of the stuff that I coach about. Those things are so important. If you don't have the business and the business together, you're not going to be able to survive to actually do the creative work that you want to do. And we want you to survive, right? So number two, you can go ahead and get part of it in advance. If there's no set pay date or if things feel a little bit vague, finally, you can ask to get paid up front. But when you get asked to get paid up front, number one, you have to be confident about it. Number two, it helps if you have a track record. When I ask to get paid up front, people see that I've read for these publications. They see my best-selling books. They see me on this YouTube channel. They're like, oh, okay, he's not going to take the money and run. But most importantly, if you're able to get that credibility through your confidence, through your work ethic, even getting a cosign, if you're connected to somebody else and someone else in your network says, yes, Damon's good for that money, offer them something. When I do major speaking engagements, when I have major projects, often what I'll do is actually apply a discount. So I'll say, you can go ahead and pay half up front and half when the project is done. Or you can pay the whole thing up front and save 5%. Now that might sound crazy when you're talking about 4 figures, even 5-figure projects, that 5% could represent 1,000 or two. Like, so you are going to eat a little bit of that. But if you think of on the grand economic scale, as far as what else you can do with that money, the opportunity cost of you not having that money, etc. Even as far as the peace of mind of knowing that you've already been paid for this project. So you don't have to hunt people down to invoice them. Not to mention security as far as knowing that you've been paid. And so if they disappear or if there's issues, they're less likely to do that. Number 3, this is the biggie. I think this is the most important thing, is not having a contract at all. Number 3, you need to have a contract. If you're listening to the music right now, it's from Purple Fluorite. Awesome producer, love their music. We go way back. My mug, Bring Your Worth. It's available at damonbrown.com. Sorry, damonbrown.net. I don't even know my website. It's available at damonbrown.net. It's a collaboration between my cover designer of all my independent books, Beck Loss, shout out to Beck, and my partner, my wife, who was very crafty, and me, because I designed it. So we split the money every time y'all buy one of these mugs. The trailer video, if you've seen my speaker reel, it's done by Neha Tawari, who's actually the founder of Version Consulting. She designed the whole thing. Her and I go way back. Every single one of these instances are people that I know intimately, such as my wife, people who I go way back with, like Purple Fluorite, or people that I've known for several years, like Version Consulting. All these instances, we had contracts. We had signed contracts, or at minimum, we had emails saying, this is how we're going to distribute things. When someone buys a mug, this is how it's going to be spread out among us. This is going to be the profit, this is the cost. All of them respected it because I respect them as a business person. This is important for several different reasons, which is actually so many reasons I can't even get into all of them with the video. The top 2 reasons. Number 1, relationships change. There's people that I've started businesses with, there's people that I've connected with. For some of them, we're cool. For some of them, we were cool before we did the project and then we haven't spoken in years. But our money from our royalties still come to the right address. Things are still split up correctly. Often we'll say we'll do a handshake or we'll write it on some random napkin. We'll do that based on the relationship we have right now. But relationships, all of them evolve. And there might be people that you collaborate with, that you work for, that you might not even get along with in the future, or you realize how they really are as far as how they work, and you realize you don't want to work with them anymore. Or, this happens often, if you end up being like myself, you do a lot of independent work, the person that you report to, they suddenly leave, or they're let go, or the department shift and they end up being promoted. And suddenly you have a new point of contact. But your old point of contact is the person that knew the contract. They knew how much you're supposed to have. They knew what kind of rights it was, whether it was work for hire, first run rights, as we say in journals or whatever. They knew all the information. That info is gone. Now, if you're lucky, they can pass on that info to the next person. But the next person ultimately is in charge. I've been a journalist, a creator, independent freelancer for decades now. There's so many times where I've had a solid lock into a particular organization or culture, and that person suddenly left, and they have to build that over again. One of the things you can't build over again is a contract. That's number 1. So it's the relationship part of it. But number 2, why you should absolutely have a contract is that there's no reason why you should keep all this stuff in your head. I created these mugs with my 2 partners about 4 years ago when Bring Your Worth came out. Shout out to y'all who have supported it all this time. Do I remember the percentages? I've done like 4 books since then, so I guess I can probably spout them, but I don't have to. And neither do my 2 partners in creating these mugs or this t-shirt for Bring Your Worth. I'm sorry, Build From Now. My Build From Now t-shirt. They don't need to do that. It's already written. So it's not that like I'm getting of old age. It's not that other people aren't reliable. It's not that, we have these bad memories. It's just this one less thing you have to worry about. So since I've done the Bring Your Worth mug, I've done these t-shirts, I've done other work. Those things pile up over time. Right now, I have a few dozen passive income sources. Each of them have their own percentages, including the mugs and the t-shirts and other work that I do. I don't need to keep it up here. And I don't even say, God forbid, that day when I'm gone, happens to everybody. You don't get out of here alive. Those contracts are in place. Those flows are in place. Those systems are in place as much as possible to actually get it to the right people so that that percentage that I get from my passive income sources, including Inc. magazine, including the work that I'm doing with the mug, including the stuff I'm doing for major organizations, those will flow into my bank account. They'll flow into the correct properties because those contracts and those systems are in place. That is part of creating a legacy. So it's something that no one else has to worry about. It's not about when times are quote unquote good. And it's not about when times are static. It's about times changing. And the secret is that things always change. The partnerships that I have, including the ones I talked about, even the one with my wife, they've evolved rapidly over the years. And so why shouldn't things be put in place so that things can evolve from that? And it might be that some of the contracts that you create have to be updated. And that's okay too, but you need some type of foundation to create from. So as you dive into your creativity and get into the business of what really inspires you, you will absolutely sleep better, you'll have a better career, and frankly, you'll be a lot safer and secure if you create a foundation based on the business of the business. And that foundation is based on good contracts. Today, we're going to talk about co-founders. I've had a couple, and how do you negotiate and get a good co-founder agreement? This is a contentious territory because so many things that we create, particularly as solopreneurs or side hustlers, we came up with it in our own brain, or we were chatting with some friends and we came up with a great idea. Those things have happened to me several times. Some of them you will never hear of, but other things became Cuddler, became, the Bites as Entrepreneur, became So Quotable, became these things that I became known for. How you negotiate and how you navigate co-foundership is worthy of talking about a lot. And it's some territories where you need a co-founder, you need that support. But sometimes we can be afraid of bringing on co-founders because we don't want to lose what we got, or we don't trust people in that way, or we're afraid to frankly share some of that power. As I talk about in Build From Now, there's people that I've coached in the past who didn't want a co-founder because they didn't want to share the power, but then they end up not getting anywhere because they didn't have enough power themselves. So we're going to talk about two big things that you want to think about as you bring in co-founders and as you work towards this. There's by no means exhaustive. I'm not going to get into legal advice. There's so much stuff. Please get a lawyer if you do decide to get into the co-founder game. But with that said, I think there's two big things you want to think about as you bring on a co-founder. Number one is that every single agreement is finite. I love Seth Godin. I love Seth Godin in general, but I love his argument and discussion about this. He says that every co-founder agreement, as in the contract, whether it's on a napkin, as we saw, I believe it was Facebook had their stuff on a napkin. It's on a napkin, or it's legally drawn up, as it was in the case working with my lawyer with some of the intellectual properties that I've worked with. It's still binding. All of them are finite. And I love Seth's take on this. Seth's take on this. I promise it's not a toke. Seth Godin's take on this. He says all of them are finite for two reasons. One of the founders decides to leave or passes away. And founders are bought out sometimes where they figure out how much this company or idea is worth. And then the remaining founder or founders pay the other founder, and the other founder leaves with their cut, right? They leave or they pass away. Natural attrition, if you want to be PC about it. So they leave, or as was the case with me, the business itself is bought and they're no longer founders. My last startup was called Cuddler. It connected people for hugs. It's the startup that I'm most known for. It came out in 2014, and we sold it in 2015. So it got really popular really quickly. We bootstrapped it. So when people wanted to acquire us, companies wanted to acquire us, it was just a matter of us divvying up whatever profit price they were offering and then splitting it 3 ways because I had 2 other co-founders and going our separate ways. Relatively clean. But how we split up and what we owned as far as the startup, that discussion happened right after we launched. So the 2 co-founders were already involved. I became a 3rd co-founder a little bit later on, but before we had launched, and I ended up being the COO and the CMO essentially. And I ended up guiding the launch. So I came on fairly early, but I wasn't the original co-founder. We did it. That first week, we had 100,000 users and 10,000 people who completed cuddles, which was the impetus of the app, which was similar to Tinder and Grindr. So with us doing that, we realized, all of us realized, it was going to get big really quickly. It was already big. It had been out for a week. Literally, we had 100,000 users. It was crazy. So we started talking. I initiated the conversation. I'm like, listen, we need to figure out how we're going to split this up. Now, we could have had the discussion earlier, which might have been a little cleaner, but it still wasn't popular enough so that it was an issue. And it still wasn't making money like that, which makes it even more contentious when a lot of money gets involved. So we spent about 3 weeks to a month negotiating what parts we owned. Some back and forth, not too heated, but it was definitely some discussions. And then we were like, cool, Charlie owns this part, then this part goes over here, blah, blah, blah. Damon owns this part. No problem. We already had that in writing a month after we launched. 6 months later, the acquisition calls started coming in. What wasn't contentious is what we own. And so when we got to a dollar amount that sounded good and we sold the company, it's like, all right, the agent that represented us gave us a separate checks based on the contract and the agreement that we had done months earlier. But imagine if we hadn't done that and then money gets into the picture. I used to live in Silicon Valley. I've heard the horror stories from the lawyers that I've worked with to people who have had their own startup tragedies, for lack of a better term. And people end up being in court for years, trying to get stuff sorted. I love Seth's advice in this. Whatever commitment you make to a co-founder, it's going to be finite. It'll eventually end. Your company will shut down or get acquired, or one or both of you will decide not to do this anymore. Whether on purpose or one of you leaves, you guys agree not to do it anymore, or one of you passes away. That's just the deal. It's kind of like a marriage. You think about marriage, that's a co-foundership. I've had both, right? Trust me, they're way more similar than most of us give credit for. So number one, remember that every co-founder agreement is finite. Eventually, you're gonna be playing End of the Road by Boys to Men, just like my high school prom. It's gonna happen, right? So number one, everything is finite. Number two, realize that contract's only going to come up when you have a problem. If you guys are cool, just like a marriage, if you guys are cool, you're not looking at how you're going to split up the assets because you don't think you're going to split things up, right? You're not going to be looking at the co-founder agreement when everything's rosy and you guys are both or all of you, because I had 3 co-founders in the past, all of you are rosy in the business. No, you're going to look when there's trouble. Gary Keller talks about this. He was on the Tim Ferriss podcast. He says your agreements should be called disagreements because you only read them when you disagree with something. Had to write it down. Brilliant. Now, Gary Keller is the co-founder of Keller Williams. If you're in the home business at all, if you bought a home like I have, or if you're in any residential neighborhood, you've heard of Keller Williams. So he's been through it. He talks about it on the podcast, really good podcast, about some of his adventures and issues that he had with the co-founder and other co-founders, obviously the Williams and Keller Williams. But this is brilliant. The point is that you're going to have issues eventually, and that's when the contract is going to come up. You need to view it as something that's going to make those potential issues in the future clear. One of my favorite adages is that the best medicine man in the village isn't well known and doesn't have the notoriety because his patients always feel better. His patients are never sick. He does the proactive stuff. The ones that you hear about, the ones that have the reputation, they happen to occur because they're more reactive, or whatever they tried to do didn't work. The best known things, to quote Dan Heath in Upstream, one of my favorite books right now, is that the upstream work, the work that you do proactively, it doesn't get the credit. A good co-founder contract, it doesn't get the credit. You might not even think it's a good contract because the stuff that's in there already saw ahead, already had the vision of the issues that you and your co-founder will have. So the best co-founder contracts, you don't have to pull them out because you already negotiated it, right? With Cuddler and some of my other contracts, we already saw how things could split apart. We already, again, with Cuddler, we already split up the shares. So if one of us wanted to leave, we knew the other two needed to buy this person out. That was already discussed. It's clarity. The best contractual agreements don't have to be pulled out because you guys already talked about stuff. So when there's rocky seas, and there's always rocky seas when it comes to partnerships, that's just the game of life, then you'll be able to look at that and say, oh yeah, we already talked about that. If we take this route, we'll do this decision. Done. Do that before you make that full commitment. Otherwise, when it gets to that finite part, when it gets to a disagreement, that's going to be way messier than it needs to be. And unfortunately, the person that's going to be paid the most, as they always say, are the lawyers. All right. I'm excited about today's show. Understanding artist contracts. If you've coached with me, even if you know me semi-personally, you know I love contracts. I'm one of the few curators, I believe, that likes law and actually likes the creating. But as a mentor told me many years ago, there's a business and then there's the business of the business. If your business of the business isn't right, then you can't do the business. If I was coming to you regularly through, say, this TV show, but then I didn't own my intellectual property to the episodes I was making, or if I wasn't getting paid correctly for it, or if there was some type of weird stuff going on in the background where the paperwork wasn't right, then that would prohibit me in the future from showing up and or getting the revenue or the legacy that should come from me doing this is 351st episode. But I own all my content with that. This is actually a conscious decision. If you don't understand the contracts that you're signing, then you could be the greatest artist in the world. In fact, some of the greatest artists in the world, and I've had episodes about this, have done amazing work, but they haven't owned any of their stuff. Or they want to pivot in a different direction, and then they had all kinds of trouble. I'm thinking of Michael Jackson. I'm thinking of Prince. I'm thinking about Aretha Franklin after she passed away, rest in peace. Like, all kinds of things can be in a mess. Today, we're going to talk about how to get your contracts right. Now, I am not a lawyer. Let's be clear. There's no JD behind my name. But I've done 27 books, soon to be 27. 27th will be out again in a few weeks. And I've helped other people with their contracts. I've coached hundreds of people, and I've had my ups and downs. I want to share as much game as possible so that you can avoid some of those pitfalls. And if you're new to the artist community, whether you're a photographer, you're a writer, you're a painter, even if you're a multimedia creator like myself, then you can get those basics so that when you do sign a contract, and all of us eventually sign some type of contract, then you'll know what you're getting into. So if you have any questions as far as artist contracts, be sure to drop a line below. But I have some questions that I get all the time. We're going to jump into it. First question, which I think is great first question, is what is intellectual property? What is IP? And more importantly, what it is not. Intellectual property, based on my definition, is the execution of an idea that was thought of, not the idea itself. You cannot copyright an idea. I can have the idea of saying, I'm going to go ahead and have something called the Bring Your Work Show, and I'm going to be connecting with people twice a week. I can't copyright or have intellectual property around that idea. But me executing the idea, which in a meta way I'm actually doing right now, me actually having this show, this actually being a product, a service, a thing, this is intellectual property. I own this show. This is in my family's name. That's the difference. So when people talk about IP or intellectual property, they're not talking about the idea. The idea doesn't mean anything, frankly. Respectfully, whatever big ideas you have, they're fantastic. But you can't hold ideas, you can't copyright ideas. And if eventually over time, you can't even tell who came up with the idea first. Right now, we're celebrating hip hop's 50th anniversary. It just turned 50 about 2-3 weeks ago in August, right? Because it started in 1973. No one can copyright hip hop because it's an idea. Now we attribute it to Kool Herc over at Sedgwick Ave and all those things, if you know your hip hop history back in '73. But we attribute it to him, but we don't actually know, like, it's not copyrighted. But Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five's, The Message, that's intellectual property. That's putting hip hop into a context and saying, here it is on a vinyl, on a record. I'm dating myself, but that's how it came out, on a record. Here it is on a record. Here it is on a cassette tape or 8-track. That is actual intellectual property. And so if someone did something with Grandmaster Flash's and the Furious Five's The Message, like Ice Cube or whoever sampling it later, which means they take a piece of the song and they turn it into another song, they have to pay the copyright owners, the people that own the intellectual property, a proper amount of money based on what they negotiate. That's intellectual property. Now, a key thing that there's a lot of discussions about I do videos about intellectual property, again, at bringyourworth.tv. There's a whole playlist about intellectual property. And then there's also some things about contracts. And in fact, I have some ultimate guides about contracts. All the links are below, or you'll see them on the side in the chat. If you see some of the discussions in the comment section, there can be some argument and confusion where it's like, oh, well, as soon as we create something, then we own the intellectual property, so we should own it forever. Maybe in a universe way, maybe in an ideal world, to be honest, but that's not how it works. When we sign a contract, when we decide to distribute something through say, Sony Music, if you're a musician, through Penguin Random House, because I've been an author many times over. I've done a bunch of books with Penguin. You see him right behind my head. You sign a contract with Penguin Random House or whatever. Once you do that, then your intellectual property isn't based on you just creating something. It's actually based on whatever contract you sign. So that's why you see artists, again, Prince. I have a couple videos about Prince at bringyourworth.tv. You can check them out right now, that talk about how he had to fight to get his intellectual property back. About Michael Jackson, him trying to get the rights back and even getting the rights to some of the Beatles catalog for a long period of time until after his death. All those different things mean that we need to separate the person who's creating things and our artistic right from making something from what we decide to give away or share, what we decide to partner with to get something distributed. Now, I own my own publishing company. It's Bring Your Worth. That's why I talk about being indie. So it's a complete Bring Your Worth collection. It's under my family name. If you go to Library of Congress, you'll see it there, right? Under the Brown name. So I'm not giving away anything. But if I want to work with, say, my last book, I worked with Union Square, which is a part of Barnes & Noble. And so it's my book, Career Remix. If you're a long viewer of the show the last year or two, you've heard me talk about it a lot. This came out about a year and a half ago. I share the intellectual property with Barnes & Noble. That means I don't have 100% ownership of it, and neither does Barnes & Noble. We share it. But that's based on the contract that was signed. So technically, I wrote every single word in the 6,000 word book. Or sorry, 60,000 word book. It's not 6,000, 60,000 word book. The point is though, when I decided to get it distributed, I decided to share some of those rights, share some of that intellectual property. And based on what was negotiated with myself, as well as with my agent, shout out to Marilyn, we were able to figure out a way that was equitable for everybody. But just because you create something, that doesn't automatically give you intellectual property rights until it's executed. And then once it's executed, it depends on what rights you might share with the people that are helping you get it out there, right? So if the Rolling Stones have a deal with, say, Columbia, they can be making all this great music, which they do make great music. They're classic. They are sharing that intellectual property of creating that music with Columbia or whatever label they're happen to be with. And that's based on how they negotiate. Hopefully that's clear, but I think it's really important to separate those things, because sometimes we feel like it's unfair because we're artists and we want to create things and I created something, so I own it. Well, yeah, as soon as you create it, you own it technically. But if you actually want to get out into the world, or if there's other facilities Like say if you end up working with a Sony or a music label, and then they end up saying, okay, we'll put you in the studio. That studio time isn't free. You might be giving up part of your intellectual property to do so. Keep that in mind as you get involved with different contracts, because it's not just the nature of, again, the business, but the business of the business. And there's so many artists, including some that I've coached over the years, that end up signing contracts and didn't realize what they were getting into. That's the difference between having an idea and then the intellectual property is actually the execution of that idea. And your rights around that idea that you execute is based on whatever contracts you sign or don't sign. Really important distinction there. You got to keep that in mind. I'll get off my soapbox on that. But hopefully that's clear. Such an important part of things, because we put our blood, sweat, and tears into these things, and then we don't realize what we're giving away. And I've signed some rough contracts, so I speak from experience. A good place to start is I did a series of shorts earlier this summer. Understand intellectual property in 10 shorts. 10 shorts, if you're not familiar, are similar to TikToks or Instagram Reels. They're 60 seconds or less, and they talk about one particular topic. I have a few hundred shorts on my channel, so feel free to check them out at bringyourworth.tv. I collected all the shorts that have to do with intellectual property, though, and put them onto one compilation. I think it's only like 7-8 minutes long. It's very brief. It goes over some of the things that will help you navigate your artist contract. We'll get more into some other resources too, but this is a great place to start. Again, it's only a few minutes long. They're shorts. So I'm explaining points and percentages. I'm explaining royalties. I'm explaining advances. I believe there's quite a few topics I'm explaining. Work for hire. So many topics that we see it in a contract and we can get intimidated or confused, or worst of all, just ignore it and just sign the contract. You gotta know what's happening, particularly if you're gonna bust your behind and get your work going. Book I recommend, and not just because I made it with my colleague Jeanette Hurt, is The Passive Writer. The reason why this book is important is because we end up breaking down different ways that writers, and I'm a former journalist, still am, but it used to be my full-time job, how journalists like myself can do independent work, can write, and then still own some of that work, some of that intellectual property that we do for these major magazines, and then do more with it. My first major business book was The Bite-Sized Entrepreneur, the one that's featured in the complete Bring Your Worth collection that's coming out in a few weeks. So it's all in there. And some of that content began with my column with Inc. magazine, which I was way more active with at that time. I've slowed down a little bit, but I still have a column with them over at inc.com/author/Brown Damon. My point is that depending on what contract I end up signing with Inc. magazine, I might not have been able to, I could have done a column with Inc., had a great idea with it, and I'm like, you know what, this could work really well as a book. And then Inc. could have said, depending on the contract, they could have said, no, you can't do that because we own that because you did this column for our magazine. Instead, we ended up negotiating a contract so that they had ownership for a set period of time. It's called first rights. They had ownership for a set period of time, and after that period of time, I can do whatever I like with it. And there's so many other things that I've done with getting that intellectual property back. So be conscious as far as what you might be doing or might not be doing with your work. Jeanette and I's book gets all into that, where it's like we sometimes sign things or we end up committing to things and we don't realize, 5, 6, 7 years later, I started my Inc. column in 2015. So years later, all of a sudden I have best-selling books based on some of the ideas that began while I was working with them on the column. But if I didn't negotiate things right, then I would have had all kinds of challenges. So be careful with that particular path. Again, I'll get off my soapbox on that, but it's so important and essential to the work that we do. Again, it's Bring Your Worth TV coming to you every Wednesday and Sunday at 1:11 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, Vegas time. Today, we're talking about artist contracts, and I'm going to y'all live every weekday. You can kind of probably hear my kids in the background. So this is live and direct. And we're hustling here. We're doing our thing. I'm trying to help you level up with your creative contracts going into the year 2024. To be frank, though, a lot of stuff I'm talking about here applies to any year, but we're talking 2024 now. All right. What is runway? What is runway? We talked about it very briefly in episodes here and there, but I want to get very specific. When people talk about runway, it is the amount of money, amount of time that you can do your work based on the money that you have. So if you have $2,000 in checking and you know it costs $500 a month to run your particular business, not counting your personal stuff, but run your particular business, then it's 2,000 divided by 500, which equals 4. That means you have 4 months runway. Not a lot of time. You better get some clients, right? That's not a lot of time. The more runway you have, the more freedom you have with your work. Now, here's the key part of it. When we sign on these particular contracts, we're often given an advance. You might have heard of that. An advance is the money that they give you when you sign the contract. Usually it'll be half the advance. Sometimes it's all the advance, but that's a little bit more rare. But it's often half the advance when you sign, and then the other half when you complete the project. For instance, if you're doing a book, this is published through Bringworth Publishing. Thank you very much. But if you're with a traditional publisher and they're like, hey, Damon, hey, Jeanette, we want you to do the passive writer. Let's go ahead and do this book. We're like, cool. They're like, great. We're going to give you a $20,000 advance. We're going to give you $10,000 now. And then the manuscript, when completed, is due about a year from now. So September, let's say of 2024, cool. When you guys have the complete manuscript and everything's edited and it's ready to go to the printer, then you guys will get the other half of the advance, which is $10,000. That's the advance. The advance, quite literally, in any case, whether it's the music industry, it's set up a little bit differently, but the same top terminology. It's a music advance. It's an advance on a TV show. If you're being like a creator for a television show and someone wants you to write a script, it's a very similar process. The advance literally is supposed to be the money that you live on while you create the project. And so if you end up getting a particular advance and they say, hey, here's a $5,000 advance and your project is due a year from now, they're basically saying, here's $5,000 to live on for the next year. Of course, if you do the math real quick, they're giving you the equivalent of $400 a month, which, I don't know where you live, but it doesn't work in Vegas. And so as you talk about these creations, that's what the advance means. The advance leads directly to runway, because if the advance isn't right, you're not going to have enough runway to make it. I've been there before. I've been excited to get a book deal or whatever. And then I'm like, well, I can make that work. And then it's a month or two in and it's like, wow, I already went through that money and I still have 80% of the project to write or create. That's a tough place to be. Runway is important because that should be into negotiation of your advance. So I know folks who have gotten major book deals. Let's say a book deal for 6 figures, which sounds like a lot. So let's say it's $100,000 for your book. Awesome, you're excited about it. Your book is due in 3 years. Okay, I got some time. And then it's due, so you put in the manuscript, cool. But then it's actually not going to get published because publishing industry is slow. It's not going to come out for another year after that because they need to schedule it. All right, so that means 4 years. You're not going to make any more money related to that book until you get royalties from the book being sold. And that's after those royalties make up for the money that they gave you in advance, which is why it's called the advance. So you might not get those first royalty opportunities until the year after it's out. So we're talking 5 years. So they give you $100,000, 3 years to work on the book. Follow the math here. The book comes out a year after that. That's 4 years now. And then your first royalty statement, which means they figure out how many copies were sold in the first year, doesn't come until the 5th year. It's 5 years. So that $100,000 check they gave you, not counting your agent, which usually takes 15%. Shout out to agents. It's completely fair. But that's the way it is. They take 15%, not counting taxes. Taxes depending on the amount, you're talking 20 to 30%, maybe more if you're a baller like that. Not counting any of that, you're living on $20,000 a year for the next 5 years. Now, you might have teaching positions, you might do a whole lot of other things. I have like 5, 6 different businesses that I run. That's part of the reason why I have the passive income and I'm involved in so many different things. Because if you're just saying, I got a $100,000 check, I'm good, let me go buy a house, that's not going to happen. Because you got to take the taxes, you got to take the agent out of it. And also it needs to last you for those 5 years. And that's if you're fortunate enough to sell through, which is the term, sell through those amount of books so that your royalties at that end of that first year are more than the 100,000 that they gave you. That's a lot of serious math. Feel free to watch the replay and, rewind it or what have you. But that's the basic core of how we make a living as artists, particularly if we have traditional systems, which is why being independent and having your own publishing company and other things, there's risk involved, but it can be way more advantageous because you get the money sooner. My point is that when you sign these contracts, it has to be based on whatever your runway is. That's why you have to know your budget. That's why you have to know what you need. And that's why you have to know, which is why I bring your worth, what your work is worth. Because you end up signing a contract and then ends up being way below market value or what you're actually worth. You might be stuck with that particular contract for a very long time. There's certain contracts that I signed early on that I've just started to be able to negotiate. Just starting to get my rights back on certain things. Just starting to negotiate that. And I've been in the game for a long time. You see the gray hairs. So whatever you sign, you want to make sure that it fits what your particular runway is. So do me a favor right now, calculate what your runway is. So as you're going to look at these artist contracts and you break it down year to year, if it ends up being that long term, figure out if it actually fits the vibe and the space that you're in. If it doesn't, it might be worthwhile going forward anyway, and finding other alternative financial resources to do so. Or it might be worth negotiating harder or maybe even passing up on the deal. Be sure to throw your questions or feedback below. But I know it's a lot of information, but it's so important. That's one of the reasons why I coach people so much, is that so many of us artists aren't familiar with that type of thing. One of the best books that you can check out on this is by Jenny Blake. Shout out to Jenny. Hope you're doing wonderful. Fantastic book. I've recommended it a few times on here. It leans more towards the entrepreneurship world, but it also fits really well into the creativity and the work that we do. This book, out of many of the books that I've read, living in Silicon Valley a few years back, the whole thing, having my own startups, this has perhaps one of the best definitions of runway. That's why I'm bringing it up here. I think there's a whole chapter dedicated to it. If not a chapter, it's a whole section, several pages. Check out the book, see her breakdown of runway. Because when you're starting something new, when you're building a business, even when you're pursuing something that's long-term artistic, like writing a book, that's like a 2-3 year process for a lot of us. My first major book took me 5 years. That was 5 years of my life and I was still pretty young. So if you're going to be taking that leap or looking into it, you need to have the longer view and understand your runway. This has, again, out of all the books I've read, one of the best definitions of runway and one of the best ways to figure out if your runway is enough based on what you have coming in, and more importantly, the contract that you're potentially going to sign. All right, we're talking heat today. This stuff is important. Again, it doesn't matter if you have the best work in the world. If your contract's not right, then you won't necessarily have a legacy. You won't necessarily be getting the income that you want to get. And more importantly, you won't have the creative control that you think you might deserve, because it really depends on the contract that you sign. Feel free to jump in. Let me know if there's any particular questions or insights that you guys have as far as with your contracts or anything, any jams you might be in, and we might be able to talk it through a little bit. Be sure and check out the link below too, as far as with the Understanding Intellectual Property in 10 Shorts. If there's anything on this replay or in this live show that you might sound confusing, I'm happy to break it down in those shorts. All right, last question, unless you guys have more. What is ownership? It sounds silly. What is ownership? What does ownership mean? It actually does mean something. It's not as simple as saying, I created it, so I own it. Ownership means who has the creative control over a particular property, idea, even service. That's what ownership means. Ownership comes down to one of my favorite terms, and I talk about it again in the guide to intellectual property in 10 shorts, understanding intellectual property in 10 shorts. Got the name of it suddenly. The link is right below or in the chat. Be sure and check it out. That will probably be the most essential episode, aside from the next episode I'm going to share with you that you should watch. But if you're cramped on time, just get the definitions. One of my favorite terms is points or percentages. Depending on the creative area you're in or your medium, you'll hear either points or percentages. Even in if you dealt with mortgages, if you bought a house, or if you're a mortgage broker or whatever, people will talk about points. If you're involved in the music business, they'll talk about points. If you're involved in the media business, as far as with books, they'll talk about percentages. These all mean essentially either royalties and or ownership. When you create something, again, from your idea, your intellectual property, and you create it on your own, you own all the percentages. You own 100%, 100 points, the whole thing. You got it. The whole thing is yours. If and when you partner with other folks, such as a distribution company that will get your stuff out there. In the music world, it might be Empire, which is something, a business that just distributes music for indie artists. They take a smaller cut than a traditional music label like a Def Jam. They still take their cut and they distribute it through their channels. They might press up some CDs for the 5 of you that are still buying CDs. Shout out to y'all. But they'll do that. But then they won't actually take ownership per se of the work, as far as I know. They just distribute it. So the independent artist still owns 100% of the percentages or the points. They own the whole thing. You might work, again, as I mentioned, like with a Def Jam or with a Sony and one of their labels, let's say Polygram. You end up working with one of them, they might say, hey, we own this whole thing. Our company owns the whole thing, but you'll get a particular royalty based on this. And so based on those numbers, maybe you have 10 points or 10%. So if the CD, dating myself again, CD sells for $20, then after the wholesale price and all that stuff, the actual profit might be $10. If you have 10 percentage points or own 10% of that profit, that means you get $1 for every CD sold. So it's $20 CD, you get 10% of that, of the actual wholesale price, which is $10. So you get $1. The more independent you can be, the more you own and get of those points or percentages. So the work that I do, for instance, with Career Remix, the book that came out about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, shout out to Barnes & Noble. The percentage I get whenever you guys buy a copy of this is relatively small compared to, say, those of y'all that have already pre-ordered this one. They have very different percentage or points because this one is actually through a major publisher called Barnes & Noble. This one is from my own publishing company called Bring Your Worth. The ownership and the percentages owned, or the points owned or gotten, are very different between these two things. I knew that going into it, but I felt like it was a partnership that was worthwhile to work with Barnes & Noble because I worked with them in the past. We had some bestsellers. It makes perfect sense to me. What you need to do is walk into these situations with your eyes open. So know that if you go independent, that percentage that you own could be 100%, as is the case with my stuff. Or if you're going to go into certain partnerships or signing a certain contract, then there's only going to be so much you'll be able to own because obviously there's other people involved. And if you end up signing particularly intense contracts, you might not own anything. And that means they can kind of run with it. I remember having a conversation with someone about the music business ages ago. Had to be 10, 20 years ago. Long time ago, back when I lived in Chicago. and they were talking about a major rock group. I won't even mention their name because I didn't want to spread any rumors. But however they set up the rock group, only one of the members, I think it was the lead singer, if I remember correctly, actually owned the rights to the name and the likeness of that group. So technically, the lead singer, who was the face of the group, could fire everyone involved, and they might have fired everyone involved, which might have been why we were talking about it at this random music party. They could fire everyone involved and then replace the guitarist, the drummer, the xylophonist, whoever was involved, the percussionist, everybody. And they still can make albums under that name, but that's because the name was owned, and likeness, the intellectual property, the execution of this rock band idea was owned by the lead singer. This is that same idea, except it could apply to a major music label. It could apply to a venture capitalist firm. Shout out to my VCs out there, but this does happen. It could apply to a major publishing company. It could apply to a partner that you end up working with, and you don't realize what contract you're signing, and suddenly they can run with it in directions that you had no intention of, even if the idea originated with you. So be really thoughtful as far as percentages and points, because that also obviously will affect your runway and how much money you'll be getting in royalty into the future. I know there's certain contracts that I signed that I knew I was giving away my intellectual property rights, but the amount of royalties or money that I asked for, I increased it by 50 to 100%. And the company said, yeah. So then that ended up being a great trade-off, where I was like, I can make double the money. I can make more intellectual property, which obviously I did, but I can make more intellectual property. I'm willing to give that away, and you guys give me 200% return based on what you're originally saying. Fantastic. We both walked away happy. We still have a good relationship to this day. Cool, not a problem. So know exactly what you're getting into. If and when you want to go deeper, this is the place to start. Beginner's Guide to Contracts and Partnerships. It's super short. It's about a half an hour long, and it's 2 or 3 episodes talking about red flags to contracts, how to build up co-founderships and so forth. Like when you create something together, you're essentially co-founders. All those different things. A lot of these adventures that I've been on, and I'm kind of going in these adventures over the several years, it's been a roller coaster ride. I'm taking all those insights, as many as possible, and trying to share them with you so that you can learn from some of those good decisions and sometimes not so good decisions in the long term that I end up making, and you're able to level up what you're doing. One last recommendation is the book Venture Deals by Brad Feld and Jason Mendelson. I do not have a physical copy, but I have it digital. I got like the first edition many years ago. Fantastic book. Brad Feld is very well known, at least within the VC communities. Very well known VC, very respected. Excellent column or articles he's done for Inc. magazine, even talking about mental health and depression and all those ups and downs that come. Even if you don't have those kinds of issues, those things come with startups and with foundership, because as an entrepreneur, as you might understand, a lot of us are kind of creating our own path. And it's yet to find that mental toughness. He talks about that. He's always been very vulnerable about it. I respect him and I love his work. I think this is his only book. I wish he would do more. Fantastic book, though. It's really simple. The subtitle is, I think it's How to Be Smarter Than Your Investor and Your Lawyer, which is cheeky, but he's breaking it down where it's all these complicated things, including percentages and points, including cap tables and investment and Series A and all these different things that even I sometimes struggle with those terms. He's able to break it down and be super coherent with it. They've updated the book like 20 times. I think it's like the 4th or 5th edition. Here's a hint. If a book has a 4th or 5th edition, that means that the publisher sold through the original edition of it, and there's demand for more copies of it and or an updated version. So if he's on his 4th version, Brad and his colleague Jason are killing it. So it's definitely worth checking it out. I'm sure they add a lot more. Again, I have the 1st edition back when I was doing Cuddler, the last startup I did. Now it's 7-8 years ago. So they've updated several times. I'm sure it's way more complex in a good way and interesting than it was before. Be sure and check it out. Again, I'm a couple of degrees away from Brad. I know he's doing amazing work. His book actually reflects that. That would be my biggest book recommendation on here. One last caveat. I know you're saying, Damon, I just want to make my music. I just want to make my art. I just want to create stuff. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. There's certain things that I've talked about on the show, or haven't talked about this on the show, that I love to do that y'all don't know about. I don't make any money from it, what have you. I think what's beautiful though is that if you decide to market or bring that stuff to the rest of the world and actually make a living from it, do a side hustle, some of those things that I specialize in, I want to make sure that you have the tools as soon as you go in, and before you go in, just in case you decide to go in, that you're ready to run with it. And if you decide not to monetize some of your stuff and not to bring it into the world as a business, cool, don't even worry about it. But just in case, put this episode in your back pocket. So today, we're talking about intellectual property 101. Again, I am not a lawyer. I cannot emphasize that more. No law degree on my shelf. Got a few degrees, no law degrees, right? But I've been around quite a bit. Done 27 books. This is actually my 27th book. Done numerous partnerships, partnered with lots of organizations from TED to the New York Post, other folks, working behind the scenes, sometimes working up front. And I've co-founded 2 companies, founded one company and co-founded another one. My second company, Cuddler, ended up getting acquired about a year after me and my partners launched it. So I know what it's like to be in the trenches and to try to figure out what exactly you need to protect as far as your part of the pie or the entire pie if you created it yourself. I talk a little bit more about this in my newsletter. It's a weekly newsletter, Wednesdays at joindamon.me. It's about fighting over crumbs. Listen, we can fight over a lot of things. That's fine. And I don't mind a good fight, being part of a good fight or us fighting to make things more equitable. But if we don't own anything, what are we fighting for? Why are you fighting over the thing that you're renting? Why are you fighting the next guy? Because they have a little bit more than you. And then the system itself is keeping all of us from being equitable. Why are you fighting over stuff that's not going to matter, frankly, when you die, when we wrap it up? Choose your fight wisely. I talk about that in the newsletter. And I think there's a lot of insight that we can get from that discussion. When we're talking about intellectual property, it has to do with who owns the execution of the idea. Let's start at the start. What exactly is intellectual property? Intellectual property is not the idea, but the execution of the idea. If you have an idea to have a flying car, dope. I don't know if we need flying cars. I'm based here in Las Vegas. People, I used to live in Los Angeles, so people don't drive as nutty as Los Angeles, but they're on the edge here for sure. Maybe someone just lost somebody at the casino and they're driving out of town. So I don't know if we need flying cars. Let's say you have an idea for a flying car. Dope. Sounds good in concept. Sounds good in theory. That's all it is an idea and a theory. So in other words, me saying, I want a flying car, I have an idea for it, and it's gonna have 5 wheels and the exhaust is gonna be in the front instead of the back. I can't sue you if you create that right now. There's no intellectual property to that. However, if I draw some schematics, fancy word for a blueprint, if I draw some schematics and I'm drawing how it's going to be set up, or I create a prototype, an example, a concept, I create it through 3D modeling, or I have 2 little kids, so I take some of their Play-Doh and I make something out of it. Then we're starting to get into intellectual property territory. It's not your idea, it's the concept. As I talked about in the video, and it's in the recent video that I did, it's in the comments. I just talked about it, about the 3 power moves that artists can make. I compare it to making music. Excuse me, both of my kids are into music, and I love music myself, used to be a DJ. And so you could have a melody in your head. Okay, that's not intellectual property. Intellectual property is when you commit that to like some type of sound that other people can hear, or you write it down in some sheet music. Then it starts to translate into something else. That's what you can protect. you can't protect your ideas. Probably because we can't really, unless you're a mind reader, we can't really trace what ideas are. So intellectual property is the execution or concept of an idea. It is not the idea itself. So when you talk to a lawyer or other folks who are protecting your intellectual property, it's not the idea. It can't be the idea, because often those ideas or those things can't be proven. When it comes to intellectual property, whoever controls the intellectual property actually controls how it's executed. And we're going to get into more into this episode. So if I control the intellectual property, this book, which I do, then I can control how it's executed into the world, what's done with it, and so forth. We're going to go a lot deeper into that, but that's why intellectual property, get the word out of my mouth, that's why intellectual property is power. So again, I can't emphasize this more because I get asked this a lot. I coach a lot of folks. That's an ongoing discussion. You cannot have intellectual property or IP, we'll just call it IP from now on, IP around an idea. You just can't, because it's not enforceable. Because you can't be like, oh, I came up with that idea. Well, if you didn't do anything with it, if you don't create proof of it. If I'm going back in the day, which I don't know if it's still valid, but I know back in the day, if you were sending a book idea, more like a proposal, to a particular publisher, or if you had a story idea and you're sending it and you're really concerned about it, then you would actually write down the idea on paper or what have you, or type it, going back in the day, and you would mail it to yourself. Because when you mail it to yourself, then that's kind of like a poor man's version of a ratification. You know, when you get something stamped, if you've ever bought a home, if you've gotten married before, something that requires a ratification where you need to have someone there that stamps it and gives a date, that's kind of like a poor man's version of doing that. Please don't do that, but that's how we used to do it back in the day. You do that because it puts a timeline on it, because it becomes verifiable. So again, to reiterate, just one last time, intellectual property is not your idea. Intellectual property is the proposed execution of your idea. The proposed execution of your idea. It's the music on paper where someone can play it. It is the model or the proof of concept of what you're going to do. Your idea or your execution of your idea doesn't have to be complete, but it does need to be created enough so that someone can execute it. That's where intellectual property comes into play. If you're talking about intellectual property, again, I am not a lawyer, I keep saying it, but it's important to know. you gotta get them involved. Shout out to all my lawyers out there. I know not all of y'all are great, but the ones that I know that are friends of mine are fantastic. So I appreciate what y'all do. Now you protect us as artists and creators. LegalZoom is a great place to go. It's probably the most popular platform as far as getting legal guidance. I've actually worked with them, so I'm not just talking. No, for real. The LegalZoom people know me well as do traditional lawyers. You know who you are. You saved my hide quite a few times, so I appreciate y'all. LegalZoom, though, is a great place to start. They will actually connect you with the insights that you need, whether it's starting an LLC or a DBA, getting the trademark protection or the copyright protection, which are two different things, being able to define those things that you particularly need. LegalZoom is a great place to start. Shout out to them. Tell them I sent you for sure. And episode that just ran, it's actually, is that the right number? Yeah, it is the right number. 418. I also have some issues with my episode numbers this week. I don't know what was going on, but I think it is episode 418 for sure. Actually, it might be 418. See, the numbers are off. 3 power moves any artist can make. Episode just premiered last Sunday. I was so proud of the work that I was able to get out as far as sharing the 3 tenets that will help you with intellectual property, as well as some fun outside clips that give you practical ways that intellectual property makes sense. It's only 5 minutes long. And again, be sure and check out the video. Share it with your brothers and sisters in your community. We need help. because we think that we execute or do something and then automatically we're protected. And we might start with intellectual property, but frankly, we don't always end up with it. Do a quick search on YouTube or on your favorite podcast platform and search up people losing their intellectual property or losing their masters when it comes to the music business, or something being executed and then suddenly they lose their rights to it. Whew. One of the reasons why I do the work that I do. I've done everything but be a lawyer. And so this is a great place to start with that. And of course, LegalZoom can help you on your journey. Are you dealing with intellectual property issues? Have you worked with intellectual property? Or do you still have questions as far as what intellectual property is? Go and jump in the comments. I will, as well as the rest of the community, will give as much insight as possible. And again, don't be afraid to reach out and get some legal advice. Man, I paid a lawyer a few $100s and they literally saved me tens of thousands of dollars. No exaggeration at all. Multiple times. So listen, don't be afraid to get that legal advice. But jump in the comments if you had any broader or general questions about intellectual property, what it is, and how it matters to you. I'm entrepreneurial coach Damon Brown. Man, I am tongue-tied today. I'm here to support you as a side hustler, a solopreneur, otherwise a non-traditional entrepreneur. You're watching Bring Your Worth show at BringYourWorth.tv. Wednesdays live at 1:11 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, Vegas time. You can subscribe for free. I'm realizing why I'm starting to stutter is that I think it's starting to get hot. This weather has been so weird. I got to tell you, in Las Vegas, it's supposed to be rainy for the rest of the week, and then today it's hot and humid. It's not usually humid. As they say, it's true though. It's a dry heat here. Go figure. And it's wet here. I'm starting to sweat like New Orleans without the food. Just let me get a po' boy. The complete Bring Your Worth collection out now. Get it wherever fine books are sold, as well as at DamonBrown.net, where you can get the Bring Your Worth mug and other things of that nature. So as I was asking, do you guys have any questions about intellectual property and what it is, what is it? I'm happy to go ahead and help out as much as possible. Why does intellectual property matter? It's like, Damon, why are you going on and on about intellectual property? It matters for a few different reasons. Number one, the person or the entity that controls the intellectual property, they can control how it's executed. In other words, what's created from it. Remember, intellectual property is the beginning of the execution of the idea, the proposed execution. The music is going to be played this way, not in your head, but it's going to be played this way. Whoever controls the IP, they can control how it's executed, when it is executed, how it's created, number one. They control who's getting paid from it. And they control how other people can use the IP. So how it's executed, how it's done, who's getting paid from it, and who can use the IP, who can partner with it. Let's start with number one. How it's executed means that, I'll give an example again of my book, The Complete Bring Your Worth Collection. Intellectual property is in my name. You know, the Library of Congress knows it's part of the Brown family. And again, part of Bring Your Worth TV, or just Bring Your Worth Publishing. So if I want to do an audiobook, I can do an audiobook. I don't need to get permission. No one needs, I don't need to check in with anybody, as they say. If I want to go ahead and do a third edition or second edition of this book, then I can do that. I can do whatever I want with intellectual property because it's wholly 100% owned by me, by Damon Brown and my company. So once you have and hold on to your intellectual property, you need the opportunity to do that. So that's one. I can do whatever I want with my book. And as of this recording, I own intellectual property to all my modern books, which I can't be more than thankful for, right? We'll get into that as far as owning your intellectual property. So that's one. The second part is you determine who's paid from the intellectual property. So if someone came through and said, hey, I want to go in and use your piece of music in the next Avengers movie. You're like, all right, great, I'd love that. But if you don't own the intellectual property, that decision's not up to you, which kind of gets into number 3. But more importantly, with number 2, whoever owns intellectual property determines who gets paid from it. You might not get any more money from it other than whatever you got to create the music, if you don't own the intellectual property. I'll give a very brief example. Several years ago, about 30 years ago, 3 decades ago, a freelance journalist, and I've been a freelance journalist for a long time, a freelance journalist did an article about the top fighter pilots in the Navy. Great. Ended up being a very popular article. Hollywood, whether it's an agent or a movie studio, saw that and said, hey, that will make a pretty cool movie. Some stars got attached to it. They bought the rights to that article from Vanity Fair or whatever, GQ, let's call it GQ, from GQ. And then that became a $1 billion franchise once Tom Cruise got attached to it. True story, you can Google it. So the Top Gun franchise, not the movie, homie, the franchise, the toys, the music, shout out to Kenny Loggins and the soundtracks and all that. Berlin's Take My Breath Away, you know, for the 80s folks like me, you remember when that video was around? That was the soundtrack to the movie. All of that was attached to this Hollywood property. This Hollywood property was seeded by an article done, I believe it was in GQ. That GQ article was done by a contractor, someone like myself. Depending on the contract that the contractor signed, that might be all that they get. That might be it. They might have gotten, let's say, $5,000, particularly back then would have been decent, for a feature article about these top pilots. Great. That's not a $1 billion franchise, though. That's why intellectual property matters. So number 2, if you own the intellectual property, you decide who gets paid. GQ, if they own the intellectual property, might be really benevolent. Be like, yeah, here's a few $1,000s, which isn't bad as a freelancer. But you're like, that's a Tom Cruise movie right now. Right, I'm taking my partner to go see it right now. What do you mean I'm getting $7,000 for creating this then a $1 million franchise? But you don't own the intellectual property, not your call. Not your call. And that leads to the third dynamics of it, is that when it comes to intellectual property and why it matters, you cannot or do control who you partner with. So let's say you create a piece of music and, I don't know, some people or organizations you don't want to be involved in. It's a pretty intense political time. Let's say you create some music and then a political campaign that you cannot stand, that you feel like they are against humanity, decides to use your joint. Do you own intellectual property? Ain't your call. You can complain about it on social media, you can fuss about it. We've seen that in the at least here in America, in the recent political, in the presidential campaign last year. Oh, so-and-so used this music in their campaign when they were on the road, you know, campaigning, trying to get votes. Okay. And you see some instances where there's a lawsuit and it's like, no, you can't use my music. I didn't give you permission. And they're like, bet, you got it. And you see other situations where it's the same type of vibe, and you see the musician complaining on social media or on the TV shows being like, man, they should not use my music. Why are they complaining? Because they can't stop them. They have no legal recourse. Unless they own their masters, or in other words, their intellectual property, there's nothing they can say. So once you sign that away, it's a wrap. It's up to the, as they say, the behest of whoever owns the intellectual property. That's why intellectual property matters. So number 1, you determine how it's going to be executed, what you can do with it. Again, I turned this into an audiobook because I felt like turning it into an audiobook. I didn't have to get clearance from anybody. I own the publishing company. I am the boss. I'm the manager. Cool. I own the intellectual property. No problem. I don't have to clear with anybody. If somebody else, which I partner with other folks in the past, I had to clear with somebody. And sometimes they said no. That's intellectual property part. That's number one. How you can execute it. Number two is intellectual property matters because that determines who gets paid. If you don't own the intellectual property, but someone ends up making buku bucks off of that intellectual property later, you don't have any recourse because you don't have those rights. And number three, intellectual property matters because that actually allows you to determine who you're going to partner with. So if some slimy organization or someone you don't rock with wants to use your music or your book or your words, your intellectual property, your execution of that, and you don't own the intellectual property, aside from complain a lot, yeah, you might be able to get a lawyer, but unless you sign the contract under duress. And the fact is that in all these cases, we usually end up signing a contract for a certain amount of money, a certain amount of access, a certain amount of leverage, and that's the trade-off. I'm emphasizing this and did the episode a few days ago about power moves that every artist can make, as well as today's episode is really about reminding you of your power. Like when you create something, you automatically have the intellectual property. It's yours. Things shifts when we decide we're going to go with a traditional book publisher, or when we're going to sign this record deal, or we're going to partner with this organization that are going to distribute it. That's why, again, you got to lawyer up. I've hired lawyers when I had very little money and I had little kids at home. But in the long run, end up saving me, again, tens of thousands. I cannot stress that enough. Barter with lawyers, use your network, get you a lawyer. Like, get you a therapist, get you a lawyer. Because it's way too much at stake. My first major book took me 5 years to write. I was in my 20s. So a good chunk of my life on that book. We're sacrificing and trading way too much of our time for these things that we're creating, and to get reckless at the end to not own our intellectual property. That's not the way, particularly in this environment. Again, I have a publishing company. This is self-published with my own little hands. I'm speaking to you on multiple platforms. This is from my own little studio. We have too much power and too many opportunities to use that power for good, to make an impact in the world, to get reckless with our intellectual property. Again, that's why I'm talking to you today. I can't emphasize it any more than that. A good place to start is my book with Jeanette Hurt. Shout out to Jeanette, fellow author, The Passive Writer. I think I have a copy of you. At least I should. There it is. Passive Writer, tiny little book. See our mean mugs on the back. Also self-published because, how you gonna do a book about passive writing? You're not gonna publish it yourself. Stop. 5 steps to earning money in your sleep. This is focused on writers. Again, my background is writing, 2 degrees in journalism. Shout out to Northwestern. This focused on writers, but I wrote it and Jeanette wrote it. So it applies to a lot of us as creatives. We talk about our passive income techniques. We give examples of other people, and we talk about how you can do it today. So check out the book. It is available right there. And as I talked about, here we go. As I talked about, there's an opportunity to create passive income with that. Again, think about the Top Gun situation. GQ didn't have to commission another writer to be part of this $1 billion franchise. They just need to license it. They might be still making residuals today. I'm not privy to that information. I wish I knew, but I don't have any insider information on that. This whole episode, Maximize Your Passive Income, talks about it. I go deep into it. It's actually a compilation of a few different episodes. And yeah, I'm going into it. I have several different passive income pathways, if you want to call them that. And they all help me take care of my family and, make sure I'm good into my years. So please take advantage of that. Are you not sure why intellectual property matters? What are some of the stories you've heard about intellectual property? And when it comes to your creative career, things that you've done, or even people within your network, what have you heard about intellectual property? And have you heard any stories of people trying to get their intellectual property back or going through that process? Love to hear your stories in your comments below. I'm entrepreneur coach Damon Brown, here to help you as a side hustler or solopreneur, otherwise a non-traditional entrepreneur. You're watching Bring Your Worth TV, Wednesdays at 1:11 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, Vegas time. You can subscribe for free. I told you it's getting hot over here. Yeah. Vegas springs are like everybody else's summer, so I'm starting to sweat. I appreciate y'all rocking with me. How can I take care of my intellectual property? You know what intellectual property is. It's the perceived execution or the proposed execution of an idea. You know it matters because number one, it determines who makes money off of it. Number two, it determines how it's being executed. And number three, it determines who can use the intellectual property besides yourself. And then on top of that, it's like, okay, how can I actually take care of my intellectual property? There's a few ways you can do this. Number one, get you a lawyer. Get some good representation. It could be someone, I do it in a more casual way. I'm not a lawyer, to emphasize that again, but I do give guidance as far as supporting people and towards actually recommending lawyers to people and stuff like that. I can't recommend you a lawyer because it's unique situations with the people that I have been able to connect. And of course, it varies from city, state, federal, all those different things. Stuff that is well above my pay grade, literally and figuratively. But find a way to get representation. It's worth too much. It's worth too much. Some of the passive income streams I have right now, some of the ways that my family's eating as we speak, it's based on things that I fought for with a lawyer years ago, approaching decades, and we're not getting any younger. So if you're watching and you might be in your 20s or 30s, I'm in my 40s. So folks that are in their 20s and 30s, I respect where you're coming from. You just want to see your art out. I know what it's like to be hungry like that. I get it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't protect your intellectual property as much as possible. So then when you're mid-career, I think that's what we call us, when we're mid-career, or close to my parents' situation, when you're late career or late stages in your career, then you have that intellectual property to do more with. So get a good lawyer, get representation, make sure that you're taking care of your business, as they say, make sure that you're taking care of not just your business, but the business of the business. You being the best artist possible, that's fantastic. You being the best artist possible and owning your work, that's the business of the business. I'm really into music. You can see patron saint John Coltrane above my head. And I love listening to artists, musicians, particularly in hip hop, talk about their record deals. And there's so many young brothers and sisters who sign a deal for $2 million, $3 million, $4 million, which sounds great. I am not a millionaire yet, but that sounds fantastic. After lawyer fees, it might be $2 million. You might give half of it away to taxes and fees. But what they're giving away is intellectual property that their great-great-grandchildren could be eating off of. Got to think about it. So we got to think long-term. And yeah, getting lawyer representation is the best route to that. Make sure it's an organization or a lawyer that you trust, not someone who's actually put up by the people that you're negotiating with. Good words of advice for everybody. If you do it yourself, you automatically have the intellectual property ownership, automatically. If I come up again with a melody in my head and I have a small piano over here and I start playing on the piano or I write down the notes, that's automatically intellectual property. Now, that being defensible in court, that gets a little bit more complicated. But the main point is that once you create something, we often get complicated with the intellectual property when we start bringing in other people to get it out there. So if it's a distribution network and they're going to help you get your music out, make sure you read the labels. Shout out to RZA. You got to read the labels. You have to. If you're not inclined or you're feeling too lazy to read the labels, which is fine. Or maybe you're all like, I don't understand what any of these words mean. I have 2 degrees in journalism, so I have a super strong bias towards knowing a lot of words. You might be like, I don't know what fiduciary means, which is fine. Get you someone that knows what fiduciary means. Don't just brush it off. You got to know what the words mean, because this is a commitment. This is a commitment. And that might mean that you might hear your music on the radio or your book might be on the shelf somewhere, which is fantastic. It could be a bestseller. I wish you luck. But then you want to do something else with it. And they're like, no, we own the rights. You're not going to do that. In fact, you need to make a sequel to it. Otherwise, you're not going to have this intellectual property again. That's up to them because you signed the dotted line. But as soon as you create something, if it's within the context of your own thing, the audiobook for the Complete Ringworth collection, I did it in the closet of my previous house. I really own it. There was no studio, nothing. Just, it was recorded there. So I'm able to control the IP in ways that I might not be able to if I worked with different organizations. So I would encourage you, if you can, get it as close as possible to finished within the means of your resources, your time, your energy, your money. Make it work. Because the further along you are, this applies to any art form, including VC funding. You know, I've done 2 startups. The further you can get to that finish line and it being complete, the more leverage you have and the more opportunity you have to actually keep your intellectual property, or at least keep most of that control. In partnership and in distribution, again, you have to read the fine print. I keep emphasizing it because it's important. And so many of us do not. We get excited about the advance, which is the money they give you up front. We get excited about just seeing our name in lights. I know what that's like, just wanting to see your name on the cover of something. It's a great feeling, but not as great of a feeling as knowing that you own the means of operation and the product from that, and that you're able to give that to your family or to your ancestors or to your mama or whomever. It's part of your legacy. Talking about contracts, 3 red flags you must look for in every contract. There's a classic episode. I might do an updated version of it. I'll be sure and put it in the links if I do. 3 red flags. Another short episode, less than 10 minutes, worth taking the time. As a freelancer, as a founder, as a speaker, I've probably signed several hundred contracts, maybe like 700 contracts, 800, 900. Been doing this for a while. And so there's certain patterns that have come up over the years, over the decades, as far as signing contracts. And that's the nice thing. I was sharing this with someone recently as a business coach and as a business owner and as a creator. You know, you guys have been rocking with me with this show. This will be the 5th year of the show coming up in December, because we're like at 4.5 years or so. And the nice thing about time is that it actually allows you to see the results of decisions that you made in the past. so I've been a business coach for about 10 years. Bless y'all that have allowed me to be with you on your journey. And some of y'all are coming back and some of y'all are doing like badass stuff. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's based on a conversation we had in 2018. Oh my God. And then in some cases, not as far as coaching clients, but some cases where decisions that were made, I was like, oh, Ew. Man, I made that decision 15 years ago. Okay. We could have did better. This video is basically that energy of me basically saying, look, I've signed 700, 800 contracts, had tons of partnerships, dozens of partnerships, all this other stuff. That stuff behind the scenes. I've sold my company. Like, I'm used to seeing contracts. These are the three things that you might want to pause. Doesn't mean don't sign them. Just like dating. There might be some red flags. There's always some red flags, some things that are a little bit off, but maybe the green flags will overcome it. At least be aware of the red flags. So if they come up later, you know what's happening. And my favorite book about negotiating, Value-Based Fees by Alan Weiss. Alan, hope you're doing wonderful. Fantastic. Veteran salesperson, negotiator. Talking about how you can make sure that you bring your worth, pun intended, to any negotiation or situation. And the fact is that when you first get started with your intellectual property, whatever you're creating, music, book, I was talking to someone recently, they have a product that they want to get out, like an invention. Shout out to you if you're watching. Again, I hope the advice helped. But in all those cases, sometimes you're able to execute things all the way. And sometimes you can get it 50% there. But eventually, you can get it out and maybe you need bigger distribution. You could have a book and maybe you need representation to get on the road, to do a book tour. Eventually, you're going to need other people. That's what I'm trying to say. That's why I'm highly recommending this book. I'm going to be recommending more and maybe do a deep dive on the book later on this year. But I bought this book when I was in a very intense negotiation. This book made a difference of easily tens of thousands of dollars. It was fantastic. I cannot recommend the book more. In fact, I need to get a new copy because I just have the digital copy. I need to get a physical copy of it. Shout out to Alan. But it talks about how you can make sure that what you're negotiating is reflective of what you're bringing to the table. And again, I got my own publishing company. I'm wearing my clothes and in my little office space and all that stuff. Even I need other people. So I don't care how independent you are, you're eventually going to have to negotiate with other people. So it's important to go ahead and be direct and clear about what your values are, value-based, what your values are, what you're bringing to the table, and what you want to get out of the situation. You can be fair and equitable about it, but you got to come correct. Otherwise, it's way too easy to lose your intellectual property along the way. What situations have y'all been in as far as intellectual property and have you been in situations where you had to get your intellectual property back? I've negotiated my intellectual property back. I'll share the story for another time, but I've negotiated my intellectual property back, and that gave me the opportunity to do more things with intellectual property. But I made sure it was a situation that made sense for the people or the organization that owned that intellectual property too. I wasn't just talking crazy like, give me back my rights. No, it had to be a negotiation. What situations have y'all been in? Are there decisions that you might have regretted where you don't have that intellectual property or that creation anymore and you're trying to figure out a way out of it? Love to hear your comments in the stories or stories in the comments, vice versa. Must be opposite day. Your stories in the comments. And I will share some stories in the future, I promise. Yeah, I got some stories too. I'm entrepreneurial coach Damon Brown, here to help you as a side hustler, solopreneur, otherwise a non-traditional entrepreneur. You're watching Bring Your Worth TV live Wednesdays at 1:11 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, Vegas time. You can subscribe for free. And you can grab the complete Bring Your Worth collection wherever fine books are sold, or listen to the audiobook by clicking the link right there.